¿Cómo están? Sean bienvenidas, sean bienvenidos a esta actividad de la Feria Internacional del Libro Universitario en su modalidad virtual que organiza la Universidad de Veracruzana. Para nosotros es realmente un gusto que esté con nosotros en esta ocasión de una manera muy especial la doctora Judith Butler, que el pasado 8 de marzo recibió el doctorado Honoris Causa por parte de nuestra Casa de Estudios, lo cual pues a nosotros como universidad pública, como país, nos enorgullece mucho que sea parte ya de nuestra comunidad universitaria a través de esta gran distinción académica, pero también nos da mucho gusto que esté con nosotros una de los personajes más importantes del planeta por su pensamiento a favor del feminismo, bueno, con su pensamiento feminista, su pensamiento que ha generado movimientos para la igualdad, sentimientos que dan también nuevos rumbos para este planeta, para esta sociedad que necesitamos necesariamente buscar hacia mejores derroteros en cuanto a las equidades, tanto de hombres como de mujeres y hombres, evidentemente. Entonces, este pensamiento de la doctora Judith Butler realmente para nosotros es un honor y es realmente un gusto tenerla aquí dentro de la Feria Internacional del Libro Universitario, pero también dentro, evidentemente, de nuestra Casa de Estudios. Y para dar la bienvenida a la doctora Butler, tenemos a nuestra rectora, Sara, Ladrón de Guevara, a quien le cedo la imagen y la voz también para que dé sus palabras. Adelante, rectora.
Me da mucho gusto participar en esta Feria Internacional del Libro Universitario Virtual 2021 para dar la bienvenida a la doctora Honoris Causa por la Universidad Veracruzana, Judith Butler. La doctora Judith Butler nació el 24 de febrero de 1956 en Cleveland, Ohio, Estados Unidos. Estudió filosofía en la Universidad de Yale, donde se licenció en 1978 y se doctoró en 1984. Filósofa postestructuralista, es profesora de filosofía en los departamentos de retórica y de literatura comparada en la Universidad de California en Berkeley. Ha realizado importantes aportes en los campos del feminismo, la filosofía política y la ética. Es autora, entre otros, de los libros El género en disputa, El feminismo y la subversión de la identidad y de Cuerpos que importan, sobre los límites materiales y discursivos del sexo. Traducida a 20 lenguas, ambos títulos describen lo que hoy se conoce como la teoría queer. Su teoría performativa del género y la sexualidad ha desafiado los planteamientos del feminismo occidental, en su mayoría estadounidenses y europeos, que se reducen al modelo de mujer blanca, heterosexual y de clase media. El discurso teórico de Butler también ha sido utilizado para señalar las bases sobre las que operan las concepciones de raza y de clase, ya que nacen de una misma matriz que considera a los sujetos como parte de un entramado de relaciones que laceran al individuo. En fechas recientes, la Universidad Veracruzana le otorgó a la doctora Butler el doctorado Honoris Causa, el máximo grado académico que la Casa de Estudios concede. En la ceremonia de entrega de dicho reconocimiento dije: si me pidieran el nombre de un autor vivo que personifique todo lo que un filósofo puede o debe ser, inmediatamente pensaría en Judith Butler. El amplio conjunto de su obra, de una extremada diversidad y una deslumbrante penetración, es sobre todo un yacimiento de inteligencia incisiva y originalidad interpretativa, de inventiva teórica. Sus libros han generado cambios de perspectiva que siguen siendo evidentemente transgresores. Han desvelado ilusiones, han derrocado sus supuestos y han desbancado prejuicios muy arraigados. En particular, han compuesto e indicado a quienes somos feministas los horizontes más fértiles y cada vez más abiertos de posibilidades que habría de seguir un programa feminista particularmente constructivo y cooperativo. Hoy, finalmente, en medio del clima de violencia irracional y sin fin que recorre al mundo entero, y en particular a mi dolorido pero siempre inquebrantable país, tengo sobre la mesa las siguientes palabras de la doctora Butler, recogidas en su lúcido y luminoso La fuerza de la no violencia. No podemos pensar la no violencia simplemente como la ausencia de violencia o como el acto de refrenar el impulso de cometer la violencia, sino como un compromiso constante, incluso como una forma de reorientar la agresión con el objetivo de afirmar los ideales de igualdad y de libertad. En ese compromiso, doctora Butler, encontrará usted un aliado en la Universidad Veracruzana, su casa de estudios. La universidad orgullosamente pública que desde hace un buen tiempo viene levantando la voz por el fin de la violencia en todas sus manifestaciones y a todos sus niveles. Bienvenida de nuevo y muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. I'm very honored to be here today to speak with you at the Universidad de Veracruzana. And I am only sorry that I cannot be there in person today. But let me please take this opportunity to say again how pleased and honored I am to be given an Honoris Causa by your university. Although my work now covers many fields, many people remain interested in my views on gender. I have found that I am, right now, less interested in developing or refining a theory of gender than in understanding why gender has become such a controversial topic. What can academics do to help clarify what is meant by gender? And how are we to proceed when those who oppose the concept or category of gender, the teaching of gender, do not rely on clear arguments in order to explain their views? Indeed, they do not choose to read in the field of gender studies in order to understand what scholars are actually doing. It's a confusing situation, but I believe there is a path forward. It is usually expected that a talk about gender, and this is such a talk, will begin with definitions. What is gender? How do you define it? Do you have a theory of gender? And if so, please explain what it is. Well, today I am less concerned with elaborating a single theory of gender, in part because of a popular sentiment that there is only a single theory, or that gender is a theoretical construct of a distinct and singular kind. So at least in these times, it is important to start with a statement that will be obvious to anyone who has been reading in the fields of feminist or gender theory, queer theory, or trans theory. For those who think that there is a single theory of gender, it may come as a surprise that within the complex field of gender studies, there are active debates about the role of theory, while some argue that gender studies should be based on empirical grounds, and others call for a materialist version of gender. Of course, empiricism is a philosophy, and so is materialism. In fact, there are different versions of materialism. So I am not sure that the debate is always usefully orchestrated. Nevertheless, let's start with a simple proposition, namely that there are a wide range of ways of approaching the question of gender, and they include materialist, psychoanalytic, intersectional, relational, historical, sociological, history of science-oriented, psychological, post-colonial, decolonial, interactionist, constructionist, co-constructionist, essentialist, psychosocial, psychodynamic, intersubjective, legal, transnational, transregional, humanist, and post-humanist, object-oriented, and planetary. That list does not even begin to address the wide range of perspectives within the social sciences, humanities, and biological sciences, geography, the history of labor, the family, kinship, the history of violence, including state and non-state-centered violence, the analysis of the public sphere, the public-private distinction within comparative contexts, environmental studies, sexuality studies, advertising, popular culture, film, television, digital humanities, literature, poetry, plays, and visual culture more broadly. Moreover, gender is sometimes taken to be synonymous with gender identity, yet the two notions are not the same. Gender identity designates a subjective form of identification and a social reality, social and psychic, for subjects negotiating a field of dynamic gender norms within their own historical situation. Gender names a form of power that organizes the public and political worlds, regulates the public and private distinction, and is not always or exclusively related to a subjective sense of self. The sex-gender distinction, central to feminist theory as well as queer and trans studies, does not substitute gender for sex, nor does it do away with all claims of biological difference or the materiality of the body. But it does allow us to ask how biological difference is regarded, how it is accounted for, what social meanings it has, and to ask about that spectrum of genetic and endocrinological life that does not always fit into what is called gender dimorphism, the ideal of two sexes, male, female, visually distinct from one another on the basis of bodily difference. Depending on the account of the biological that one has, the formative or interactive effects of culture and environment may well be central to understanding both the development and meanings of gendered bodies. When we ask how women's bodies are treated in medical settings, in educations, or in public life, we are asking in part how they are defined by policies that have been taken for granted and that do not always affirm their equality or their dignity. If women can be regarded and treated differently, then the very idea of what it means to be a woman will change. Feminism has always relied on the fact that gender categories are historical, that it is possible to revise one's view on what it means to be a woman. This not only changes our ideas of what womanhood means, but also our ideas about womanhood, about what womanhood is or can be. The achievement of greater economic and political equality for women changes not only the way that women are regarded, but our very sense of what a woman can be. Thus, the idea of potential and of transformation is built into the very idea of gender. Despite the many thoughtful approaches to such issues, the popular characterization of gender theory is that it denies the material reality of the body and the specificity of sex. While feminist historians of science have shed light on the changing frameworks for understanding what sex is, sexual difference, and even materiality. Further, sex assignment assumes that a mix of medical and legal authorities determines sex at birth, and that no determination can be made without that authoritative designation. The ordinary procedure demonstrates the general point that sex depends upon the act by which it is determined and the criteria used to make that designation. Once that is established, it is possible, sometimes even desirable, to open the field of self-designation to those who dispute the assignment given to them at birth. If we think of sex assignment not as a punctual act, but as a revisable process, then the matter of sex, its very materiality, is from the start bound up with psychic and social powers, subject to categorical determination by designated authorities, and so a social practice, revisable. This characteristic of sex assignment has always been true, but only now does it come to light in a new way. Only now that determination can be challenged for those who are trans or gender nonconforming or intersex in the name of a more livable life. It is all the more surprising that the intensifying critique of what is called gender treats it, well, as I've said, as a singular construct, idea, theory, or ideology, given the burgeoning intensity of the field, its internal complexity, the rifts that have opened among several strands of the field, the open and unfinished debates that tend to drive discussion in classrooms across the world. It may be, however, because of this very sense of burgeoning intensity and complexity that reactions to gender studies have formed that seek to reduce it to an ideology, and a singular one at that. Thus, I propose that we do not settle the question, what is gender, or even what is your theory of gender. It's important, perhaps, to refuse or maybe suspend that question in order to defend the inquiry into gender, gender relations and practices, gender in the field of policy, urban studies, and global economics, to name a few. Gender inquiry begins with a set of questions and refines those questions over time. So one question I would like to pose is, what work is the category of gender doing in society right now? What function do debates over gender serve? To answer the question straightforwardly would confirm the skeptic's presumption that gender is singular, easy, that it's an ideologically driven thought or conviction. In fact, the study of gender is not ideological, but the movement that seeks to build that impression of gender as an ideology is itself ideological. What we can rightly call an ideological reduction is performed by the critics of gender, if by ideology we mean a false account of the world, with the power to make itself seem credible to an unwitting public, one that serves the purpose of reproducing the status quo or reproducing a fantasy about the stability of the nation and patriarchal power. The term ideology is meant to associate a field of study or a set of complex inquiries with totalitarianism or forms of Marxism that seek to impose a single form of thought on an unwitting and susceptible public. At least this is what it seems to mean if we follow some of its contemporary usages within public life. But ideology is a term that has a history, and it too can be studied and understood, debated and discussed. It's not just a piece of discursive artillery or a rhetorical effect. For instance, there are many ways of understanding ideology, and there are active debates about how it should be used. Marx and Engels meant one thing in their text, the German ideology, and Louis Althusser revised that significantly in his writing on the ideological state apparatus. In both of these cases, ideology, understood as a coordinated set of beliefs or convictions, served the purpose of reproducing capitalism and or state power. Ideology tends to shape as forms of, to take shape, it tends to emerge or to surface as forms of reality that not only obscure the best interests of workers and citizens, but does so by providing moral rationalities for their exploitation. For instance, the idea that it is morally right to take a low wage or not to join a union because that would identify you as a troublemaker, a disciplinary problem, is an example of an ideological conviction that the subject herself adopts in deciding what course of conduct to pursue or not to pursue. The idea that you do not report your husband for abuse because that would upset the family is an ideological idea. Why? Because it uses a moral imperative to keep a woman in a situation where she suffers violence or degradation. She believes it is her proper role to suffer violence and degradation. Althusser thought that ideology was very difficult to change. He claimed that it pervaded our lives, that it circulated like air, characterizing a set of beliefs that are accepted as obvious and difficult to question. The effort to shine a light on ideology, much less to break its hold on our thinking, was bound to be a difficult one. It involved calling what we have come to call the obvious into question. What we are taught in school about the good life, the proper life, and what it means to be a good citizen, a good man, or a good woman, accounts in part for our formation as proper subjects within a particular society. And as a result, our very ability to criticize ideologies involves posing questions about them, asking whether such norms and mandates are necessary, and whether the social world has to be organized along these lines. For such questions to emerge, a certain distance has to be taken from the process of reproducing social structures as they are. In other words, it has to emerge from the perspective of a bad or a broken subject, someone who has failed to approximate the norms governing the ideal notion of the subject, someone engaged in a mode of life lived not fully legible from within the dominant framework. It is, in fact, from these positions, I would suggest that an alternative imaginary can emerge. The important work of Karl Mannheim, Ideology and Utopia, published in 1936 during the rise of fascism in Germany, considered whether fascism could be understood as an ideology that emerged from capitalism. That was, of course, an important question, and it remains one for us today. He sought to examine the unconscious origins of what he called mental fictions that deny the actual conditions of nature or society, that seek to reduce its complexity to a simplistic formulation. Whereas, in his view, ideologies work to preserve existing social orders in the face of challenges and instabilities, utopias activate certain potentials within society in order to foster a collective imaginary of social transformation. Fascism was called an ideology because it sought to reestablish nationalism and racist hierarchies in the face of new demographic movements and dire employment prospects. It drew on the imagery and legends of older versions of the social order, like the Romans, to kill and expel Jews, the Roma, the physically challenged and ill, and the communists. Mannheim argued that the attack on so-called dangerous ideas failed to understand that there is always a danger associated with visions of social transformation, and that utopian potentials can seem especially dangerous to the extent that they portend more radical change. In this way, ideology has as one of its main objectives to suppress utopian thinking, especially the kind of thinking that seeks to transform traditional social orders and to bring out new potentials of equality and freedom. While Mannheim sought to develop a complex hermeneutic approach to social ideas, the Frankfurt School took issue with the way he set up this opposition, this tension between utopia on the one hand and ideology on the other. Members of the Frankfurt School claimed that Mannheim undermined their capacity to conduct what they understood as an effective ideology critique, which would include a dialectical account of utopian visions as sometimes preserving the very status quo they seek to transcend. What about false utopias, they asked. What followed was an elaboration of immanent critique, and in time, the entire idea of ideology critique was itself subject to a consequential criticism by Jürgen Habermas, who argued against the negativity of critique and claimed that social theory must furnish the grounds for asserting transparent and intersubjective norms if it is to serve as an effective defense against fascism. So ideology has a rocky history, yet much of this is unremarked in the current critique of so-called gender ideology. The operative assumption of the anti-gender ideology movement is that ideologies are overzealous political convictions that are allies with Nazism or totalitarianism, and that threaten the traditional norms of gender, family, and society. And yet, it is precisely the questioning character of gender inquiry that the opponents of gender seek to shut down, seek to censor. They are the ones who ally themselves with censorship efforts that bolster state powers and authoritarian regulations of health, education, law, and the expressive freedoms that belong to the public sphere and that should belong to all women, all LGBTQI people. As I have suggested, the attack on gender as an ideology reduces the complexity of gender studies as a field or a set of interlocking fields, and it takes aim not at the conclusions that are reached, but the very acts of questioning. Does the family have to be this way? Are there other versions of the family? Does marriage have to look like this? Is marriage necessary? What are the alternative versions of marriage? The anti-gender ideology movement seeks to reduce the complexity of gender itself in an effort to restore a social order that has already been challenged by many social and economic forces. It seeks to recreate and strengthen imaginary ideas of family and nation precisely at the moment in which they are being socially challenged. This last concern with national identity links the attack on gender with the attack on migrants that we see in so many parts of the world, in Latin America, in Europe, in the United States. Gender, figured as a construct that comes from foreign sources, is said to infiltrate society. But so too are migrants figured that way, as infiltrators. And it is as if they are all foreign, and they are all dangerous, and they are all threats. They seek to destroy traditional notions of nation and family. My suggestion, then, is that the critique of gender ideology exemplifies ideology itself. To call gender or gender theory ideological is itself the paradigmatically ideological move. These critics seek to associate gender with fascism or communism on the one hand, but also with imperialism and the destruction of local cultures on the other. They borrow rhetorical strategies from the left and from the right, seeking to mobilize a broad spectrum of people to regard gender as one of the ultimate dangers to society. Significantly, the anti-gender ideology movement signals affinities with left discourses and anti-totalitarianism, but they refuse to engage in any strong criticism of contemporary authoritarianism. Indeed, the new authoritarians, Bolsonaro, Orban, are important for the anti-gender movement precisely because they embody and enforce forms of patriarchal power that are challenged by LGBTQI movements, as well as feminism, and indeed by all movements linked to a commitment to radical democracy. Unfortunately, the Vatican has accepted the formulation that gender is a diabolical ideology, thus invoking the figure of the devil for the category of gender and the projects of gender studies. Within this rhetoric, gender is not just one force of destruction among many, it names the ultimate contemporary force of destruction. It apparently has the power to destroy both civilization and the family, both of which are said to depend upon an interpretation of the Bible as asserting the distinct and superior powers of men over women. Well, no such claims are actually made by gender studies scholars themselves, aware as they are of their relative lack of power in relation to university administrations. In such comments, I think we see a sudden return to biblical authority and oblique references to witchcraft and the devil's work, which has, as you know, a terrible history of witch burning, as Silvia Federici has taught us. It also lets the foreign term, gender, collect myriad contemporary fears together, especially fears about social disintegration and economic precarity. If we ask what accounts for economic precarity in Latin America, I think no one would say, oh, the ideology of gender. And yet, why do people fear the so-called ideology of gender? Well, because it is the name they give for their felt sense of economic precarity and social instability. Of course, the aim of the anti-gender ideology movement is not to persuade its audience that gender studies is not academically bona fide as a field of study or discipline, but also, clearly, that it is an example of the decadence and destructive character of contemporary universities and apparently, allegedly, politicized academic standards. There is no effort to demonstrate argumentative claims by close or persuasive readings. Indeed, there is no effort to study the field, to know its complexity, and then to assess its claims, as we would do if we were proceeding on a scholarly basis, as we would do if we were respecting the norms of professional journalism. Indeed, the claims made about the field are reductive, incendiary, and ignorant. They don't care whether they're right or wrong. They serve another function. They are meant to stoke fear in the face of a phantom. In some instances, the claim is proudly made that, hey, we do not read any of the books in these fields. And for some Christians, that would mean allowing themselves to be tainted by diabolical forces. Others claim that they do not have to read any of these books from the field of gender studies in order to dismiss them out of hand. The result is that paraphrase and caricature substitute for the text itself, casting these texts as ridiculous or dangerous, or sometimes both, impervious to the inconsistency of the double claim. In both cases, the criticism rejects both the standards of journalism, which would require some evidence for claims made, and academic publication, which would require that one demonstrate extensive reading in the field. At least that is what we tell our students when they attempt to criticize a field. But the problem is not just that the anti-gender ideology movement doesn't care whether its arguments are clear, grounded, and persuasive. They don't even care whether their arguments are right. The point of its public utterances and allegations, the point is to mobilize populations against gender and to convince them that gender is the name for what threatens their livelihood, their stability, their known way of life. To accomplish this rhetorical task, the anti-gender movement appropriates left discourses, as I mentioned, that are critical of imperialism and colonization. And this is especially surprising, if not disturbing, and it produces confusion among those who, for instance, link queer, trans, and feminist work with anti-imperialist and anti-colonial perspectives and struggles, as most do. Admittedly, there's been a critique of the imperialism of mainstream LGBTQI human rights organizations by important queer theorists such as Jasbir Puar and Joseph Massad. Indeed, much contemporary queer scholarship has reoriented itself in the wake of those important criticisms. But when the Vatican enters the fray and starts to claim that gender studies is an imperialist enterprise imposed on the South by the North, for instance, he does not include LGBTQI human rights as a problem. Indeed, he has defended some gay rights on several occasions, and we certainly applaud that. But the left critique of human rights discourse has never gained the kind of traction one might expect in Latin America, where human rights still primarily signifies the opposition to dictatorship, state-sponsored violence, torture, disappearance, and femicide. Indeed, the feminist reliance on human rights norms to articulate and defend the radically unacceptable character of violence against women, queer, and trans people has generally been welcome in Latin American countries, and especially because it invokes an emerging set of globally shared norms that such violence, such pathologization, such discrimination is wrong. Thus, the Pope can occasionally defend the rights of gay and lesbian people, less so trans and queer, at the same time that he opposes the colonizing effects of gender. How can he do this? Well, gender, in his view, is not a human rights issue. Indeed, it is a threat to the very notion of the human. In this way, he parts company with the queer critics of gay imperialism and homo-nationalism. As you know, the Pope came of age within churches imbued with liberation theology, which taught that the Bible should be read through the perspective of the poor. This is an important and progressive, transformative, emancipatory position. Some of his remarks continue to echo that position. And yet, as you also know, in the last several decades, the influence of liberation theology throughout Latin American countries has been checked as many more conservative Catholic and evangelical groups have taken over, united in part by a crusade against gender in order to defend the ideal of civilization that Christianity is said to have brought to the world. The result is a confusion of discourses. In some instances, gender is said to be an attack on Christianity, even sometimes called Christianophobia. And this is done most dramatically by a group called Agenda Europe, whose manifesto refers to the colonization of human rights by LGBTQI groups. In that case, the critique of the colonizing power of gender implies that LGBTQI movements have misappropriated human rights claims for their own ideological purposes. In other words, this is a long-winded way of denying basic human rights of LGBTQI people, even when, as we know, the statistics of violence and feminicidio are incredibly high, especially against such groups. And as you know, some anti-gender activists claim that the idea of gender implies a false sense of choice. They claim we are born a sex, that the sex is God-given, and that we defy the will of God if we seek to change sex. They also worry that gender is a code for trans, and that trans people want to choose to be something that they are not. Such arguments rest on a fundamental, if common, confusion. Few people understand their lived sense of gender as a choice. Most trans people would tell you this is not a choice, this is who I am. And yet, many people do believe that these same people, that they should have the legal right to change their gender if they choose. So where does choice enter? Well, This last is their political and legal freedom. That is what they are fighting for. Some trans theorists and activists argue, I am born this way, the basis of Lady Gaga's famous anthem to gay life. And this position is perfectly consistent with the claim that they should therefore be free to change legally their sex assignment and to be treated by medical and other public institutions as a trans person or as the gender that they designate. The anti-gender ideology movement confuses these two senses of choice without realizing that it is no contradiction to choose to be who one is. Kierkegaard, the great Christian, surely thought so. Just as it is possible to deny who one is, that too happens all the time. And we see that in self-inflicted homophobia or self-inflicted transphobia. And the reason this can and does happen is that identity depends upon a reflexive determination that takes place within a cultural field of names, categories, practices, and descriptions. That field is historical in nature. In claiming that to elect a legal sex reassignment constitutes an excess of personal liberty, anti-gender advocates take aim at one of the central features of liberal democracy, namely personal liberty. At the same time that they claim that the gender movement is totalitarian, guilty of inculcating its truths in schools. But what if, like other academic exercises, gender studies is a form of critical thinking, one that asks, are our current social arrangements just? And if not, how can we make them better? For this reactionary movement, the anti-gender ideology movement, the term gender attracts, condenses, and electrifies a diverse set of social and economic anxieties produced by increasing economic precarity under neoliberal regimes and pandemic shutdown. Stoked by fears of infrastructural collapse, anti-migrant anger, and in Europe at least, the fear of losing the sanctity of the heteronormative family, national identity, and white supremacy, all this converge on the destructive force of gender as a foreign invasion that is responsible for the destabilization of one's way of life. The vanishing of social services under neoliberal regimes puts pressure on the traditional family to provide care work, requiring the fortification of patriarchal norms within the family and the state. Once gender is successfully demonized as a destructive foreign influence, infiltrating the body politic, destabilizing the traditional family, it comes to stand for all kinds of imagined or real infiltrations, migrants, imports, the disruption of local economies through the effects of globalization. In other words, it becomes overdetermined, and overdetermination, Althusser tells us, is one key feature of ideology. Thus, gender becomes a phantom, sometimes specified as the devil, a pure force of destruction threatening God's creation. Such a destructive power can only be subdued through desperate appeals to nationalism, anti-intellectualism, censorship, expulsion, more strongly fortified borders, and in some countries in Eastern Europe, police lockdown on gay and lesbian and trans public spaces. The anti-gender ideology movement crosses borders, linking organizations in Latin America, Europe, Africa, and East Asia. And the opposition to gender is voiced by governments as diverse as Macron's France and Duda's Poland, circulating in right-wing parties in Italy, showing up on major electoral platforms in Costa Rica and Colombia, boisterously denounced by Bolsonaro in Brazil, and responsible for closing gender studies in several locations, most infamously at the European University in Budapest in 2017, before it was forced to relocate to Vienna. Perhaps you know the networks that amplify and circulate the anti-gender viewpoint. They include the International Organization for the Family, which boasts thousands of participants at its conferences. The online platform Citizen Go, founded in Spain, which mobilizes people against lectures, exhibitions, and political candidates who defend LGBTQI rights. They claim to have over 9 million followers, and they are ready to mobilize at an instant, as they mobilized against me in Brazil in 2018, when a furious crowd burned the effigy of my likeness outside the venue where I was to speak. The other organization I mentioned is Agenda Europe, consisting of more than 100 organizations. It casts gay marriage, trans rights, reproductive freedom, and LGBTQI anti-discrimination efforts as so many assaults on Christianity. My suggestion then is that anti-gender movements are fascist trends that support increasingly authoritarian governments. The inconsistency of their arguments and their equal opportunity approach to rhetorical strategies of the left and the right produce a confusing discourse for some, but a compelling discourse for others. But they are typical of fascist movements that twist rationality to suit hyper-nationalist aims. They insist that gender is an imperialist construct, that it is being imposed on local cultures of the global South, and in doing so, they draw on the language of liberation theology. And sometimes, as the right-wing Italian group Pro Vita maintains, gender is figured as intensifying the social effects of capitalism, whereas only, they claim, the traditional heteronormative family can defend against social disintegration and anomic individualism. All this destructiveness seems to follow from the very public existence of LGBTQI people, but also feminism, new families, queer families, gay marriages, intimate associations, and ways of living outside of traditional gender norms and outside of traditional families. All of these modes of existence are dangerous. And when people start claiming their right to public existence, these movements become all the more dangerous in the eyes of the anti-gender ideology movement. Indeed, let's also remember that they are attacking feminist claims to reproductive freedom, feminist claims to legal protections against sexual violence, and against economic and social discrimination. It may seem strange to say, but the anti-gender movement is not a conservative position with a clear set of principles. No, it is a fascist trend, because it mobilizes a range of rhetorical strategies from across the political spectrum to maximize the fear of infiltration and destruction that comes from a diverse set of economic and social forces. It does not strive for consistency or for coherence, because its inconsistency and its incoherence is part of its power. In his well-known list of the elements of fascism, Umberto Eco writes, "The fascist game can be played in many forms, for fascism is a collage, a beehive of contradictions." Indeed, this perfectly describes the anti-gender ideology today. It is a reactionary incitement fueled by an incendiary bundle of contradictory and incoherent claims and accusations. The form of fascism manifests instability even as it seeks to ward off the destabilization of the social order. The opposition to gender often merges with anti-migrant furor and fear, which is why it is often, in Christian contexts, merged with Islamophobia and forms of racism. As I mentioned earlier, migrants, too, are figured as infiltrating, engaging in criminal acts, even as they exercise their rites of passage under international law. But in the imaginary of the anti-gender ideology advocates, gender is like an unwanted migrant, an incoming stain or pandemic, but also, at the same time, a colonizer or a totalitarian who must be thrown off. As a fascist trend, the anti-gender movement supports ever-strengthening forms of authoritarianism in the name of restoring patriarchal power in the state and the family. Its tactics strengthen state power to intervene in university programs, to censor art and television, to forbid trans people their legal rights, to ban LGBTQI people from public spaces, to undermine reproductive freedom and the struggle against violence directed at women, children, and LGBTQI people. It threatens violence against those who have become cast as demonic forces and whose suppression or expulsion promises to restore a social order under duress. This movement has found new support under increasingly authoritarian regimes, ones that have further consolidated their power under the emergency powers instituted under the pandemic conditions. So in addition to defending the rights of inquiry, the rights to imagine society otherwise, we should also be considering how best to understand our world during these times and how best to make a persuasive public argument when argument itself is no longer valued. This is one reason why we must defend the freedom of universities, their autonomy, and the global rights of academic freedom. For when thought itself becomes dangerous, when asking questions becomes dangerous, we are surely living in dangerous times. It may seem odd to say, but if we are committed to challenging authoritarianism and fascism both, we should be defending the study of gender and all those social inquiries that strengthen critical thought for our times. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Dr. Judith Butler. Paso la palabra a Germán Martínez, organizador de la Feria Internacional del Libro Universitario Virtual 2021.
Pues muchas gracias, rectora. Y yo creo que esas palabras que escuchamos el día de hoy en la voz de la doctora Judith Butler, pues nos debe de llevar a reflexionar y actuar para una mejor sociedad, sin duda alguna, donde prevalezca la equidad. Pues muchas gracias por acompañarnos, gracias por estar aquí con nosotros en una actividad de la Feria Internacional del Libro Universitario que organiza la Universidad Veracruzana. Hasta luego.